Hello, everyone. This is Jamie from the TTA Center. It's about 1:20. Um, we're slated to begin at 1:30. Hopefully, everybody sees a slide deck presentation title page from the North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission. So if you don't see that, just let me know. In the meantime, we will wait until everyone else arrives. We have 88 individuals who have signed up today, so we do have 10 or 11 minutes to get started. Thanks so much for logging in today, and we'll be with you as soon as we can. Thanks. Hello, everyone. It's Jamie again. It's about 1:26, so we will give everybody about 5 more minutes to start. And everybody should see a PowerPoint slide title page on the intersection of substance use and human trafficking. If you don't see that, let us know so we can help you. Again, it's Jamie and Amanda with you today from the TTA Center, and Christine Long, who is the Executive Director of the North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission. So we're really excited to be here with you today to bring this information to you. So we will wait just a few more minutes. Thanks. Hello, everybody. It's about 2 minutes until we start. So let's give everybody a tad bit more time, and thank you so much for attending. Okay, we will. It's 1:30, and I like to start on time and finish on time as well. So again, thank you for logging in and registering. Um, Today's webinar is the intersection of substance use and human trafficking, presented by the North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission. Our presenter will be Christine Long, the executive director, and I had the pleasure of meeting Christine at APNC earlier, or late last year, actually, during one of her presentations. I thought this might be a really good topic for our prevention community and those of you who participate in TTA trainings sometimes. A few housekeeping items. Due to the size of the webinar today, everyone has been automatically muted. If you would like to jump in with an audio comment, please just let us know in the comment box or the Q&A box, and we can give you audio rights. In the meantime, also feel free to add questions in the question box. Amanda will be tracking those questions, and we'll be taking a short question break every 15 or 20 minutes to make sure that we address any concerns out there. A couple of other items. 60 minutes after the end of the webinar, you will receive a survey, a training survey. Please fill the training survey out. It will help us improve our training offerings. Also, several days after the webinar, you should receive a certificate of attendance with your CEUs. Afterwards, we're hosting actually 3 very large webinars yesterday, or today and tomorrow, and plus we have some staff members who are out due to being under the weather. So sending out those certificates via email may take us a little bit longer than usual, but we promise we will get those out to you as soon as we can. And also we will post parts of the webinar on our help desk database for further reference as well at a later date. But in the meantime, let's get started. And Christine, thank you again for joining us, and we're looking forward to the conversation.
Yes, thank you so much. Okay, so if we are ready, I first wanted to thank Jamie, actually, just for giving us this opportunity. When we spoke at the APNC conference in October, it was the first time we had spoken or presented to a population that was individuals that work with those with substance use and misuse disorders or addictions. And so I was actually really blown away by the amount of just people in the room that had come across this, and it really helped me to realize that this could help us identify some victims and get some people services in our state. So thank you so much. And yes, so to give you a little bit, I also want to give you a little disclaimer that I've had something over the weekend too, so I'm hoping to get through this without any coughing spells. I apologize if I don't, but let's see. So to get started, a little bit of an overview of what we will be talking about today. So, you know, it's always good because the people are on different learning fields of what they know about human trafficking. And it is a very broad field, lots of different scenarios that fall within human trafficking. So we will review the definition, scope, and a little bit about what we see in North Carolina. And then we'll really dive into the intersection of human trafficking and substance use, as well as the importance of talking about the mindset of a victim survivor and kind of where they are when many of us interact or come across victims or survivors. And then we'll talk about recognizing and responding and what you can do if you come across this. If we have any extra time, I'll tell you a little bit about the Human Trafficking Commission. But I believe, Jamie, was everybody sent? I think there were a couple handouts, right?
Yes, I believe so. And yeah, they will be available on the website as well, on the help desk. Everything should be posted after too if they didn't receive it.
Okay, terrific. So there is a handout on the Human Trafficking Commission and some stats for North Carolina, and then a very long handout that has more to do with responding if you think you've come across a case. So we'll get into that a little bit more. But when we look at human trafficking, you know, we hear this term referred to a lot as modern day slavery. And I like to give 2 definitions. This one still fits the law within North Carolina and the United States, but it's a little bit simpler to break it down. So human trafficking really is minors that are involved in any commercial sexual activity Adults induced into commercial sexual activity through force, fraud, or coercion. We'll break that down a little more as well. And then children and adults induced to perform labor or services through force, fraud, or coercion. And then we also put up here, we often forget to mention organ trafficking, but we have not seen cases to my knowledge in North Carolina of organ trafficking, but we know that it does exist along the Mexico-United States border where people are trafficked for the purposes of organ removal, and that does happen in different parts of the world. So I like to put that in here as well. When we look at the actual legal definition, this is kind of that longer definition, federal definition of human trafficking. It breaks it into sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And you see here that it is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for a commercial sex act induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person has not obtained 18 years of age. So once again, the key thing here is that if it is a minor that's involved, then there does not have to be force, fraud, or coercion proven in court, although that's usually present as well. And for labor trafficking, the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. So this is where we hear about involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery for the purposes of labor. I always like to point out here that our state law closely mirrors this federal law, so we're really lucky to have a state law on human trafficking and some statutes that address this on a state level. And also that transportation is not necessary. You know, when we hear about drug trafficking or different types of things, we think of someone having to be transported across state lines or county lines. And with human trafficking, that really does not apply. Transportation can be included, but you can certainly be trafficked from your own home and never leave your home. So I like to point that out as well. So if we get a little bit more into force, fraud, and coercion, we like to give examples of this because it really helps kind of break down. Force, you know, we see a lot. Of course, force can be kidnapping. It can be confinement or somebody that's locked within a place and not let loose. But human trafficking often fits many other scenarios that don't include kidnapping or confinement. And so some of those are physical assault and the things that you see on this list. Forced substance use or misuse, we consider under force as well. So this does qualify, where we will see traffickers that use substances in order to either initiate someone into human trafficking or groom them into it even. And we also have starvation on here, you see on the list under force. That is because we do see traffickers often use food as a way of forcing someone into either labor or forced sex services. So often someone that is involved in commercial sex, if they don't meet a certain quota for the night, then they don't eat that night. And so we do see food and starvation used under force. Fraud, I like to think of and describe fraud more as tricking someone. This often presents itself in someone that that kind of brings you into a relationship under romantic terms, you know, and you believe that, you know, the victim often believes that the person loves them, they've fallen in love with them. It's part of that grooming process. It can also be false promises, whether that's marriage or employment, a promise of a better life in the United States or somewhere else, promise of a job that will pay a certain amount of money and then in reality doesn't pay at all or doesn't pay as much as you were promised. Fraud can also be increasing debt. So, you know, bringing someone to do a certain type of work like farm work and promising them that they're going to make so much money a week, and then in reality you deduct their room and board and food and other things, and so they're not really making what they were promised. Coercion, I like to say the best way to really describe coercion is threats. So physical harm doesn't have to happen, but the threat of either harm to someone else or to yourself is believed enough that it convinces someone to engage in commercial sex or forced labor or labor purposes. So this can be also confiscating documents. This happens with both foreign nationals that are brought into the United States and trafficked, or U.S. citizens. We often see U.S. citizens where their documentation is confiscated. It's a little bit more of a method of coercion for foreign-born because there is such a danger of them not having their own documents and possible deportation if they can't prove that they are who they say they are or legally here. We also see threatening to report somebody to the police or threatening legal ramifications as forms of coercion. And so this kind of breaks down to you some different ways. We often look at human trafficking as kind of the act and the means and the purpose. And so the act would be that recruitment and what's kind of used to recruit or obtain a person. The means being, you know, what type of force, fraud, and coercion they use. And then the purpose either being for commercial sex or labor services. Okay, so this slide, I think it's really important to point out that really a victim of human trafficking, we have seen cases that fall within absolutely every demographic line. And so this is not a crime that necessarily targets certain genders or socioeconomic classes. Although certain things may put people more at risk, the one commonality is really a vulnerability to exploit someone else with. And so that vulnerability could be poverty, could be a past history of abuse or a lack of support system. It could also be a low self-esteem. It could be things that we see in many of our youth and young adults, like a desire to fit in or maybe a desire to be helpful to someone else. Anything that can bring someone in to groom them or exploit them can certainly be used to eventually traffic someone else. It's also important to me to know that this also applies to traffickers, that we've seen traffickers and people accused and convicted of this crime from every demographic line as well. So when we look at the scope of this, so there are different estimates out there. There are estimates as low, when I say as low as, the lowest estimate I think that there is about 20 million people enslaved globally. And the highest one is on this slide, the 40.3 million people enslaved globally. And to give you just a visual of that, that's roughly the population of Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, and South Carolina combined. And so when we look at the world stats, we also know that this is a $150 billion a year industry. So this is the second largest criminal enterprise in the world. It's next only to drug trafficking and very closely tied with arms trafficking. So the International Labor Organization, this estimate also changes depending on who you look at. Some estimate that around 6% of those enslaved in the world are children. Some other estimates actually have that higher, up to about 50%. And then I think it's also important to point out that about 15.4 million people were believed to be forced into marriages across the world in 2016, and that we do see cases of forced marriages that have elements of trafficking or are human trafficking as well. About 89 million people over the past 5 years have experienced modern day slavery at some point, to give you some of those international stats. Now, when we look nationally, hundreds of thousands are estimated to be trafficked within our own borders every year. Polaris is our National Human Trafficking Resource Center and runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So they collect a lot of different stats and put out some great information. But they do estimate that the number of victims in the United States to be in the hundreds of thousands. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children is also a terrific resource, and they do a lot of data collection on endangered runaways. And so they have estimated that 1 out of every 6 runaways in 2016, I think is the date for that, yes, were likely victims of sex trafficking. And they have also collected research that shows that a large percentage of those potential victims were in the custody of social services when they went missing. So we know that children within the foster care system are at risk, not just for running away, but for sex trafficking as well. I just realized there was something else I wanted to point out. So I'm going to go back to this international slide because I have some notes written down to tell you that when we look at international trafficking, some of the situations that we do see are situations like child soldiers in certain countries, people enslaved in brick masonries around the world. And there is, of course, different types of government forced labor. So North Korea currently has been reported to have the highest amount of government forced labor, where about 104 people per 1,000 are believed to be enslaved there by their government, many sold to do work for other countries or China and other countries. So, and I also wanted to point out that if you are interested sort of in the international larger picture of human trafficking, there is a whole movement called fair trade. So fair trade is a movement where products that we purchase are kind of certified or guaranteed to be made without the use of slaves. And so you'll see at Starbucks, for example, that they have a fair trade coffee that you can buy. And so there is a movement to try and help people use their purchasing power to decrease the amount of products that are made by slave labor in the world. And there is an app called Slavery Footprint that is neat to check out, that kind of walks you through different things that you buy and what's made by slave labor. If anyone is interested in that, I would recommend that they look it up. So back to that national. So there have been cases of human trafficking identified in all 50 states. The federal government and many departments within it have, for the past several years, dedicated funding, more and more funding even, to fight this crime. So some states have used the federal funding to create task forces or launch case management programs or specialized type services. And we also have some North Carolina agencies that have dedicated funding as well in small, much smaller pots. But in June of 2018, there is a report that's issued every year by the U.S. Department of State that's called the Trafficking in Persons Report. And it does kind of give a synopsis of every country in the world and talks about human trafficking and what's happening or what's improved in those areas. And so it does say in the 2018 report that the United States continues to be a source, transit, and destination country for men, women, transgender individuals, and children. Both U.S. citizens and foreign nationals are subjected to sex trafficking and forced labor. When we break it down a little further into North Carolina, this does come from that National Human Trafficking Resource Center, or Polaris, where they collect tons of data from the different calls and tips that they get throughout the year. And so they, in 2017, have ranked North Carolina as 8th in the nation for the prevalence of calls and potential trafficking situations. Now, it is important to point out that this is based solely on calls to their hotline. So this does not include cases that were confirmed within North Carolina that did not go through the national hotline, which is the majority of our cases. And it certainly does not encompass all human trafficking. The other thing that's important to point out is that in 2017, we had a project through UNC called Project No Rest that did a very large-scale public awareness campaign across North Carolina and flooded North Carolina with TV and radio ads to raise awareness about human trafficking. So although we have typically ranked within the top 10 states in the nation, we know that we ranked 8th in 2017 because of these radio and TV ads that pointed everyone to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So when we look at North Carolina, why North Carolina? And, you know, a lot of us that have been doing this work for a while kind of have this slide on why North Carolina, but in reality, human trafficking is everywhere. And so we often realize that these might be some of the main reasons that we're seeing it in North Carolina, but there are probably many other reasons. We do have an interstate and highway system throughout North Carolina, and our interstates that connect to major cities outside of our state. We have a high need for agricultural and migrant labor and processing plant labor. We also have a lot of coastal tourism. And coastal tourism and your military bases are on this slide because we do tend to see more adult entertainment around places with coastal tourism and military bases. And it really does somewhat tie back to that demand for commercial sex. High numbers of universities in North Carolina, which is a terrific thing, but it does also create a vulnerability, a pool of students who are sometimes financially stretched, and they fall a little bit more prey to some of the ploys or tricks to ensnare people in human trafficking. And then you might hear about where the Super Bowl was recent, about human trafficking at the Super Bowl. And in reality, we know that any major sporting event, the human trafficking is kind of around those events as well. And that does go back to that supply and demand. Of course, the Super Bowl is such a large scale event that that's why you hear more about it every year during the Super Bowl. And then the opioid epidemic, I have to include that on here because in North Carolina, there was a Castlight Health publication recently that listed in North Carolina with 4 of the top 25 cities in the nation for opioid abuse. And so we do know that this epidemic is impacting human trafficking, and we'll dive into that a little more later. But I hope this gives some ideas about North Carolina. And when you think about interstates and the movement of drugs, it makes sense that those same interstates and systems would be used to move people as well. So let's see, our next slide is to give you some ideas. Okay, when we look at cases that we have been able to confirm in North Carolina of labor trafficking, this gives you an idea of some of the industries in which we have seen it. So there have been sort of their door-to-door magazine sales or traveling sales crews, domestic servitude cases, so people that hire nannies or housekeepers and in fact labor traffic them for those purposes. We have seen labor trafficking cases within the factories and plants as well as our agricultural sector in North Carolina. We've had confirmed cases within restaurant and food service industry and some begging and panhandling rings. And then you'll see illicit massage on here. This is one area where it crosses over into both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. But these are basically commercial fronts, commercial business fronts where it poses as a massage business, but it actually operates more as a brothel inside. And so we know that across North Carolina, our state licensing massage board has done some research and investigating and estimated that there's around 400 to 500 illicit massage places around North Carolina, and they have taken some actions to try to increase some of the regulations and things that might in fact deter some of these businesses in our areas. So, and then of course we actually have had some cases in North Carolina too where people have been brought into the United States for the purposes of playing on sports teams and were trafficked in the sporting arenas. So this is obviously not a comprehensive list. Drug trafficking would actually go in here as well. We've had cases in NC where people were forced to operate as drug mules or selling drugs or carrying drugs on them. And so we could go into depth in so many of these areas, but wanted to at least touch on the main that we've seen. When we look at sex trafficking in North Carolina and those industries, we do have to include, of course, the illicit massage on here and the agricultural on here as well. So we have seen sex trafficking in North Carolina where some of these farm work camps have had women or individuals brought in the evenings for commercial sex and that were trafficked. There was actually a recent conviction outside of Wilson, North Carolina, that involved a minor being taken to some camps. By far, what we hear the most about is sex trafficking through the internet or online sex trafficking. And so there are many different avenues with this as well. But there is a lot of commercial sex and escort service type type things advertised online. We'll look at a slide next, and that might be where someone is stationed at a hotel and buyers come to that hotel, or it may be an out call where someone comes to someone's home or other places for the purpose of commercial sex. Pornography, it's also really important to point out that there is a crossover and intersection between pornography and human trafficking. So in the manufacturing and distribution of pornography, if force, fraud, or coercion is involved, then it does fit the definition of human trafficking if there's a commercial element. The commercial element does not have to be monetary. So say, for example, over the internet, in order to join a certain child pornography website, you have to trade your own picture of a child engaged in pornography. So at the moment that that trade happens, that's a commercial element, and it does fit the definition of pornography or of human trafficking. Especially if there's a minor involved and there's a commercial element, then that's really all you need to define human trafficking as well. Now, we often don't see child pornography cases or other pornography cases called human trafficking or charged or convicted that way because there is such solid laws to pursue the pornography charges route with as a crime, that you don't see human trafficking being charged as much there. But it is a situation where service providers across the state that get money to provide services to victims of human trafficking, whether that's clothes or food or help connecting them with therapy or other needed services, they can open up a case that's a case for services, even if the human trafficking charge was not given on that case. So brothels are another area where we see sex trafficking in North Carolina. Of course, it can happen in hotels. It happens at truck stops, bars and strip clubs. We will talk a little bit more about pimping. Pimping is kind of its own term within human trafficking. So we do see cases where someone poses as a boyfriend or someone that actually forces or tricks someone into commercial sex. And it has sort of its own, we could do a whole hour on this itself, but I will have a slide on it later. We also see family facilitated trafficking, and this does cross over sometimes as well into substance use, where someone in the home may, look the other way if a very much older gentleman is taking their young daughter or son out, is dating them if they are bringing groceries or other things to the house, when in reality, this could be a situation of pimping and a parent that kind of looks the other way. It can also be family facilitated, where a parent maybe does have an addiction of some sort that they are trading a child or another family member in order to bring money for that addiction. So I want to make sure. Yeah. So when we look at sex trafficking in North Carolina, April of 2018, Backpage was the typical website where we saw almost all of the postings happen for commercial sex. And Backpage was shut down in April of 2018. And so we have seen a number of different shifts take place. So there are a lot of different websites you see here where people may post for commercial sex, or even the illicit massage businesses post advertisements on some of these sites. And so what we have learned is, since Backpage has shut down, that the online advertising is still our biggest avenue, but however, it's shifted to where there's lots of different websites that may be involved. They're not always based in the United States, so it makes it a little harder to investigate. And some of them are membership based, so you have to join them in order to look up anything at all. But we do know that social media apps are also increasingly being used more and more. Even Facebook and other types of apps, dating apps, those kind of things are being used in human trafficking. So I think, let's see, before we kind of move into this next slide, it might be a good time to see if we have any questions. Amanda, are you showing any questions?
I don't see any questions that are coming through. So if someone does have a question, they can type it in the chat box and we can ask Christine.
Well,
I don't see anything, Christine.
Okay, well, I can always go back if we do see something. But to kind of, yes, get into a little bit more of how there's an intersection between human trafficking and substance use. As I mentioned earlier, human trafficking is really second only to drug trafficking. And so many drug trafficking rings have over time entered the human trade, mostly to diversify their business. Really entry costs into human trafficking is low, and the interstate systems, while you're moving drugs, you can move people just as easily, and they are kind of easy to hide within one another. As we've seen different actual, not all human trafficking includes rings and organized crime rings, but when we do talk about drug trafficking and human trafficking rings, there's rarely a rival type of violence to get into the human trafficking side where people are competing for where they're selling drugs or different things. It's not really that way with human trafficking. So the other thing with human trafficking instead of or along with drug trafficking is that if or when someone is caught, the penalties are less. There's little risk of losing a profit for that. And humans, of course, can be sold over and over again, whereas when you are trafficking drugs and you're bringing those drugs in and cutting and distributing them, once you sell them once, you have that risk of bringing more drugs back in again. And so humans can be sold over and over. So I like to talk a little bit about, in my past work when I was working with families, primarily families that were experiencing homelessness and individuals that were kind of marginalized in the community, I often felt like I was doing all of the assessments that I was trained to do and still was missing something. And so now I think back and I wish that I would have known more about assessing for human trafficking, because if you do sometimes think that you're missing something, then this could be the area that it is. So victims fall through many cracks in our system that could have identified them and helped them much earlier. And some of the ways that they might fall through are examples in this slide. It's really important for us to have an awareness of how we might intersect with victims and survivors so that we can identify them and get them services, as well as so we don't re-traumatize anyone. But to give you some examples of things that we see without proper identification of someone that's a victim, law enforcement, may arrest a human trafficking victim or survivor on a substance-related charge. We often see in cases of where a trafficker who has control of one or more victims, often the victim is the person that drives the vehicle or even owns the vehicle. And so if it is pulled over and there are substances found, then they as part of that mind control and trafficking, they claim that as their own and often end up with being charged for substance related things. We see this in hotel rooms as the same. So if when there's sex trafficking within a hotel room, often there are drugs within the room as well. So the buyer that is coming to the room can purchase drugs that are in the room, whether that be marijuana or whether that be a number of different drugs or even Viagra that's sometimes there for sale. So the court system is also an area where we see that victims are sometimes prosecuted for that substance-related charge. We also see victims that are prosecuted for prostitution. They're charged with that when in fact they're being forced into the commercial sex or tricked or coerced in. There are some projects now in North Carolina, a new one launching that is going to try some new things to try and identify potential victims of trafficking that come into the court system. Our child welfare system and our educational system may also kind of deem or determine that a child is just out of control or is acting out, instead of realizing that their abuse is still very active and continuing, whether that's, often we see child welfare called or responding to a house because of suspected abuse, but rarely is that report claiming human trafficking. So there's also a very large movement within our state right now to help, and actually some new mandatory screenings in place that if a worker does see a number of red flags, it will launch a certain number of questions and different things that they'll look at. Because we know that, like I said, a lot of our even foster care children within the foster care system are at risk of being trafficked, if not already have been. So our shelters and our housing programs, we often have housing programs that have very firm rules of dismissing someone for either testing positive for a substance or from promiscuous behavior, instead of really assessing the possibility of control and that this person is under control. Our medical professionals, same type of thing. They are seeing victims of human trafficking, and our substance use treatment programs could be missing this as well. So, common situations, to give you an idea of some common situations that involve both substances and human trafficking. And when we look at familial trafficking, we talked a little bit about this with maybe a parent or adult family member that sells their child or another family member for the purposes of getting funds to maybe pay for their own substance addiction. We really do. It was recently, I was listening to a story from a survivor that her mother actually began selling her for sex at 3 years old. And so at that age, her mother was addicted to opioids and would show her a ton of love and appreciation after she had sold her. And so she really worded it and said that to her growing up, this was like a chore in her mind. This was just something that she did, but she did crave that love from her mom afterwards. And so she said at a little bit of an older age, like around 8 or so, she realized this wasn't the kind of chore that friends of hers had at school, and she realized at that point that this was wrong, and was just too ashamed and scared to tell anyone. She talked when she shared her story as well about Child Protective Services opening her case many, many times and even placing her in custody at 12 years old, but still never quite putting the pieces together that she was being sex trafficked. So that's kind of one example of familial trafficking. We do see drug dealing related cases where and especially this can be within gangs or other, gang related fields where someone is forced into a gang and forced to sell drugs or carry drugs for traffickers. These cases are particularly difficult and challenging to identify and then help within a court system, because we are so used to seeing cases where someone is caught with drugs on them or is selling drugs as being clear-cut cases, especially if there's a gang involved and the person is assumed to be a part of that gang. So farm labor camps, I did want, yeah?
Christine, I do have a question that came up here. Sarah is wondering, what type of trainings do medical professionals receive, such people that work in the emergency room, get for screening victims of sex trafficking?
Yeah, so that is a good question. I have a slide towards the end that gives some good websites or things to Google that there is some good training out there. One of them is SOAR, SOAR, and one of them is HEAL, HEAL, that are online webinars that are free for medical providers. And in North Carolina right now, there's nothing that is actually required. The Human Trafficking Commission just finished wrapping up a study with the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services that looked at the need for this among healthcare providers, emergency rooms, as well as first responders. And so our next stage is actually to try to look at what materials we'd like to recommend and how we would roll that out. So we are hoping to see some movement towards that a little bit more, but there are a number of different groups. I have a number of different healthcare settings that I present to, and that are coming up even in the next couple of months. So thank you for that question. Any others, Amanda? Or?
No, I don't see any others that are coming up.
Okay. So with the farm labor camps, one thing that I wanted to bring up, so in North Carolina, we use a lot, we need and use a lot of migrant labor to help get our crops in, and often this involves a process called the H-2A visa program, where we bring in guest workers from other countries to work on the farms for a dedicated amount of time. And what we've learned with the H-2A visas, a couple of things that make them particularly vulnerable is that they are assigned to a particular camp or grower, which means if they are being in some way, shape, or form mistreated, or then they cannot just walk off the camp. Their visa will void at that point if they leave the site. And so a lot of our H-2A workers, there's lots of different housing options for them in North Carolina, but we do have a number of labor camps. We actually have around 1,900 camps across North Carolina where farm labor and guest workers are stay at for, anywhere from 3 months to 6 or 9 months even of the year. And so one of the things that we have learned is that drugs will often be offered on site in these sites as well. And it's kind of deducted from their earnings often, but that it is a part of these camps and in these sites. I know of a case of a U.S. citizen that was actually a man experiencing homelessness in another state, and he was recruited outside of his homeless shelter and told that if he would come for 3 months to North Carolina and work on a farm, he was given a ridiculous amount of money that he could make. And so he did ride in this van to North Carolina and was placed on a farm in a rural area. There was a trailer that had 15 to 20 men sleeping in it at night. And he realized very quickly that he was tricked. He said they would be taken to a sweet potato farm in the daytime. They would pick baskets of sweet potatoes, and for every basket they filled, they were given a number of tokens. And then at the end of the week, the farm labor contractor would come and they would trade in their tokens for their money, but not before he would deduct room and board and food and any substances they may have purchased from that money. So he very quickly realized that with the room and board and food charges and other fees, he was not going to make what he thought he was going to make. And while they did have kind of armed guards with rifles there, he was able to walk off the site and hitchhike to a city. And when he realized that he was a victim of trafficking at this point, he talked about some of the other men in this trailer that were in fact addicted to the substances. And he knew that that was the only reason that they continued to stay and do this work day in and day out. So that gives you a bit of an example there. And really, when we look at illicit substances nationally and internationally, people can work longer hours, and if they're using substances or addicted to substances, less concern of them disappearing with earnings if they know that they come back with their money and they get the substance that they need. In addition, workers can do harder work, backbreaking work in the fields of agriculture. Children given drugs can perform the acts necessary to produce child pornography. There's cases of child soldiers being given drugs as well to commit the crimes that they're forced to commit. So these are kind of some different situations. Recruitment tactics. So if you kind of look at, I guess, if we looked at that act, means, and purpose, that act of how you recruit someone, some of this does overlap a bit, but really traffickers are looking to take advantage of any vulnerability to find their victims. So some of those tactics can be actually targeting the types of places that they can hang around where they will find people that are addicted to substances. And so they identify an individual with an addiction, and then use that as part of the grooming process to force them into labor or sex services. So there are cases of recruiting happening outside of substance use treatment facilities, methadone clinics, of course, shelters and other places. There are cases of recruiting happening outside of our courthouses, where maybe youth or young adults are asked to pay restitution for different things, and then traffickers are there to say, hey, I got a way for you to make some money to pay off that restitution fast. And it's all just a trick to get them kind of lured into this. Providing substances to a victim can also be a way that it facilitates the actual first trafficking incident to occur, and even develop a dependency to keep it occurring. Using a substance can also, part of that grooming process can make someone become indebted to the trafficker, so that they then are willing to do whatever they need to pay off that debt. And then as well, you know, cases where someone is kind of staying close to someone that has an addiction in order for the right time to get them to sell their a family member or a child in order to pay off a debt or to continue receiving substances. I'm looking at my notes here, but yeah, I have a note here. This is especially true. You know, some of our programs, whether those are housing programs or treatment programs, are kind of unaware of the different types of pressure that they might put on somebody. So we do have homeless shelters within North Carolina that still charge a fee for someone to stay every night. You know, there may be 7 days free, and then you have to pay $10 a night to continue coming. So these kind of things kind of put people vulnerable. You know, they're looking for safe and stable housing. They're looking to get in out of the cold, and then they have to come up with this money in order to do that every day. So if we looked at kind of that recruitment process, and then we also the act of recruiting somebody or obtaining somebody, we can also look at this from the side of how do they keep somebody in place. So the manipulation and retention tactics that are used, especially that intersect with substances. So traffickers do use highly addictive substances, often to keep their victims in fear of withdrawal and willing to do what is asked of them in order to avoid that withdrawal. Substances can also be used as a form of punishment, so withholding that so they go into withdrawal, or giving them substances as a form of punishment. It can be a reward. It can also be an indoctrination. We've seen some different gangs over time that have used cocaine and alcohol as a way to indoctrinate young victims into gangs and commercial sex through that force and that drug use. I also recently had met a victim that was actually trafficked at 13, and she was initially kind of trafficked through the use of alcohol. She talked about how at 13 her mom was in treatment for cancer, her dad was in the military and out of the country, and so in order to get to some of her different church appointments and different things, she was accepting rides from youth within the church, and a group of those youth actually one night pressured her into drinking some alcohol, and then had put some substance in the alcohol that caused her to pass out. And when she woke up, she had been raped multiple times. And of course, they had some pictures of that and used that to continue to force her to do whatever they needed her to for a period of about 3 months. And when she talks about that substance, you know, she saw it at 13 as her choice. She was pressured into drink, but she chose to drink and was just too ashamed to tell anyone what was happening to her. So then let's see, victim arrest. So this is an area too, whether a victim is arrested for a drug possession or anything else, shoplifting, anything, really only intensifies their reliance on that trafficker. You know, now you have a criminal charge on your record, you have court fees, you have fines to pay off, and so it really kind of ties them even more closely to what's happening to them, unless it is identified in the system that they're a victim. Traffickers also may introduce a substance to a victim in order to keep them able to perform the work. So opioids are kind of known for numbing both emotional and physical pain. And then I think I've mentioned that they also offer substances to buyers in the commercial sex market. So a trafficker may threaten to expose a substance use or other things if a person doesn't continue to work for them. So these are different ways that manipulation and retention, and it's often kind of framed in a way of, once someone is addicted to a substance, a trafficker can easily say, like, you're doing this on your own, to feed your own habit, like this is really your own problem, and it kind of reinforces that shame and responsibility back on the victim instead of where it really should lie. Let's see. So when we do move into mindset of a victim a little bit, this might be a good chance for me to ask Amanda if there's been any more questions.
There's actually one that just came up. Pamela asked if there's any stats on the number of agencies in North Carolina that actually charge individuals to obtain shelter services.
I don't know of any stats. I know that, because a couple of things, not every shelter that, or housing program or even a substance treatment program is licensed in the same ways. And so I know that if a shelter gets federal money of any kind, if they get government assistance, then they are probably registered and they do have to declare up front if they charge a fee, but it is allowed. And there's a program called the Emergency Solutions Program in North Carolina that's some of the way that federal money gets passed through to shelters. And so they definitely do have a record of those that they fund that charge it. But I'm not aware of one easy way to get that. Sorry about that. And I do think that a lot of shelters are transitioning away from that model, but there are definitely still some that do it. Okay, so when we look at the mindset of a victim, so you kind of have probably already heard me kind of interchange the terms victims and survivors. And I think most of us that present and talk about this, we typically use the term victim if we're talking in front of, law enforcement or prosecutors or, the criminal justice type system. And then we use the term victim if it's still talking about someone that is still in the life, that is still being victimized. And we do try to make a shift towards using the term survivor when someone has come out. But out of the life and are launching on their road to healing and recovery. So when we look at, I thought this might be, this happens to be a good one to bring up, but back in October there was, Vice News published an article. I have not followed up on this, but I need to, and this was an example. The article itself did not use the words human trafficking, but what they describe in the article definitely fits the definition. And so this is a Recovery Connections Community Rehabilitation Center. There was an article and actually a lawsuit filed that detailed in the mountains of North Carolina, people that were made forced to work and did not receive the pay from that, lived in trailers, were verbally abused to stay enrolled. And many of those that were enrolled in the program were court ordered at that time. My understanding is that has immediately in October been postponed, and the correctional system is no longer mandating anyone to this program. But the article talks about how the people were worked long and unpaid work days in retirement homes, assisted living facilities, and even fast food restaurants. Many people were, oh yeah, I said that. So then no recovery program was provided, not that matters when it's the forced labor, but because they were, I guess, taken there for the purpose of recovery. And then many participants continued to misuse substances while in the program in order to cope with the conditions that they were living in. And so I haven't heard any follow-up on this, but I thought this was a good example of how it can intersect with human trafficking and how we really can see this anywhere. Separate from the substance use and misuse topic, there's also a case that has been in the news some of a group that was trafficking people within fish markets in North Carolina, and many of those were children that were being used and forced to work in these fish markets. And so that one I have not seen come to court yet, but I know that there had been arrests made in that in those cases as well. So it really can be just about anywhere. And when we talk about the mindset and why someone doesn't leave, you probably have picked up on some of those things already through this presentation, but there can be many, many different reasons, you know, that use of threats and violence, or the belief that maybe their child or a sibling or others would be hurt if they don't follow through with this. There's often that distrust of government, especially for those that come from outside of the United States and are familiar with governments that are paid off by wealthy individuals, or sometimes law enforcement corruption in other countries. And so there is sometimes that belief that it's not trustworthy to go to law enforcement or government. Many times, people are aware that what's being done to them is wrong, but they don't realize that this is a crime and that it has a name to it. You know, we never have anybody that kind of calls up and says, I'm a victim of human trafficking. It's usually them describing a number of things that are happening to them, and they don't know that term, human trafficking. And so often too, you know, we see whether it's labor or sex trafficking, people are isolated, and some of them have been groomed that way, to where they have burned bridges with family and friends and others. They've had to quit school or other things, so they truly are isolated. And then of course we see cases of isolation where people come here from other countries, so they really don't know where they're at and can't necessarily read the signs on the road. They have limited English proficiency, so that's a method. That's isolation as well. We also see that people are kept kind of in these states of exhaustion and illness, which keeps them somewhat just induced. They're isolated, they're exhausted and sick often, and so they're almost foggy-headed a lot of the time, and their mind is operating in that alarm mode and crisis mode all of the time. So of course, depending on the situation, shame and self-blaming and feeling responsible, and that happens with both domestic cases here in the United States and foreign national cases that come in. You know, we have a number of different cultures where shame over not paying off a debt is a very, very big deal. Shaming your country is a big deal. And so people that will stay in illicit massage or other type of businesses, brothel type businesses, just based out of this, they have to pay off their debt, or they're too ashamed. You know, we've seen cases of brothels and illicit massage parlors where the country that they're from may have a covenant or a code up in their own language, and it talks about how this is what's expected of them by their government. And so sometimes that kind of fraudulent schemes keep people in that situation. And then, of course, with substances, that can keep someone in a situation as well. We see situations where someone's pimp is also their dealer, and so they continue to be involved in commercial sex, or because that pimp is also the dealer that's given them the drugs that they're addicted to. So people are often moved frequently in order to keep them from becoming familiar with people or places. This happens too with some of the larger organized crime rings, where they're kind of on a circuit where every 3 to 5 days they move them to new places. And then, of course, just being unfamiliar with the culture, or having limited English ability, can also be something that makes it really hard for someone to leave the situation that they're in. I mentioned that we would come back a little bit to talk about pimping a little bit more, and that, oh, wait, I need to go back one more, sorry. When we do talk about mindset, and I look at my notes here, I wanted to point out that when I talk about someone being kind of kept in this state of exhaustion and illness, and even just the trauma that their mind is in at the time, I wanted to bring up that often in these cases, people victims that come out of the life or are in the hospital maybe getting an exam, they can't remember things in linear form. So they may tell you what's happened to them, and those instances are accurate and real, but they may not tell you them in the right order. And so this is important to realize, that sometimes you're trying to figure out, okay, where did this happen? Where did, and so we have found, and others have found, that using a holiday, okay, or major events, okay, where were you 4th of July? That people can then put some of this together a little bit better. Where were you at Christmas, or presidential elections, or big type of event, Super Bowl? Maybe things that help people remember where they were in those different points of time. And it's also important, if you are a caseworker and you're documenting things in your notes, to be careful with that, because if those files are subpoenaed later, it can look like this is an unreliable witness because they've changed their story or they've remembered things in the wrong order. And while there are experts that can testify in court to explain why this happens, we often find that if the individual has an attorney, that those kind of details may be better protected in an attorney file instead of a case management file, because they can protect the information a little bit better. Okay, so now back to this one. So when we do look at, so to give you an idea about the pimping side of human trafficking and sex trafficking, of course, all of this is a business. All of human trafficking is about profit and is about supply and demand. But when we look at pimping in particular, there actually are, there's books written on how to pimp. There's documentaries on this. And so what we see typically from city to city and situation to situation are many of the same terms and processes, and a lot of similarities. And so it does kind of, like I said, we could talk about this in an hour of its own. But really, when we look at these different scenarios, the business side of this is that there is, of course, this selection and recruitment process, which just has to do with a vulnerability. A courtship process, which doesn't always occur. So sometimes, so there are lots of different terms within this world of pimping. Like anyone that's involved in it is involved in the life. And there are different kinds of pimps. So a guerrilla pimp is someone that does not use courtship in order to bring or recruit someone in. They use just flat out force. To force someone into being under their control or violence. But there are also what's called Romeo pimps. So these are pimps that do go through kind of a grooming and courtship process to make their victim believe that they fall in love with them. But all of these processes include isolation and transitioning someone into performing commercial sex, and they all include these different methods of coercion and control. So control with occasional indulgences. And so it's very similar to kind of domestic violence type thing, domestic violence and wheels of control. I'm trying to think what else. Part of what we see in this world, sometimes pimps will brand their girls or boys or men or women that are under their control. And so they might tattoo them with a certain tattoo, or even we've seen where people do a certain tattoo that's a number, so they can number their victims. So we often see things like these kind of controls that not only kind of make them, it's branding their property in their mind, but it's that mind control as well on the individual to begin to see themselves as an object and property only. The other thing that we see, sometimes when we're talking about substances being used in this situation, pimps can, if they have a victim that is addicted to a substance and to the point that they know they're going to continue to come back for that heroin or that whatever, then they can, this is not a situation where you'll see them beside someone, because their victim will, go out and do what they need to do to raise their quota and come back with that money. And so in some ways, they see this as easier to control someone else if there's substances involved. they also tend to normalize it as someone supporting their own habit, and that they're, hey, a manager of your money or this and that, to kind of put that blame back on the victim. I know, I think, does anybody have any questions here on this one? The next, actually, maybe I should go to a case example. The next slide is a case example that I thought. So this is a guy that was in North Carolina that was considered a pimp and has now been federally indicted to federal prison. And so it's all public record what his case entailed. And so to give you some idea about this, now I do want to remind everybody that traffickers can be any demographic, anyone at all. I don't really like the stereotype ideas, but this example does give you a good idea of kind of this whole business and world of pimping. So this guy, Eric Thompson, had his own licensed entertainment business, and it was a legitimate entertainment business with a studio that he worked out of. And he called himself Gigo, which stood for Got It Going On. But he would often recruit victims through a number of different means, but he used this entertainment business as the main means. So one example was a college student that was needing money, in trouble for money, and he often used social media and other ways to reach out to people and offer them a way to make quick money, or tell them that they could be a model or this and that. And so this was often how people kind of got intertwined in this. And so this particular victim had gone thinking that she may do some modeling, and then realized when she was in the studio alone that it was not a good situation. There were guns in the room and different things. And so she did some modeling for him, and then he would not let her out of the room until she performed oral sex on him. And then, unbeknownst to her, he recorded that and sold that image online for his own profit. He, in addition, used it to blackmail her to come and work for him for several weekends. So that was one example. When this case went to court, he of course used the internet and all the social media sites and posted on Backpage for the escort services. But there were thousands of pages where he had used Facebook as a way to just reach out to people and send them a message or a friend request, and then start chatting with them and grooming them. And at one point during the investigation, the other thing about these cases is that they are very hard cases to investigate. They take a very long time to investigate. And at one point during the investigation, law enforcement had 16 different people tied to him that were being victimized by him. And so one of the important things to know is that, he would threaten them. He used a gun to threaten them. He would choke them. He would do a number of different things to keep people. He was considered kind of that guerrilla pimp. But in the end, when they needed to pick him up for an arrest, they needed to be able to prove this money is all under the table type money. So they had to be able to make a case for how much he was making a year, so that he couldn't bail out and then threaten all of the witnesses in the case. And so it did take a little bit longer, but they were able to get a conviction. Okay, Amanda, do we have any questions at that point?
I had one that come up, but it's related back to the labor camps. They're wanting to know if any of the labor camps in North Carolina had been prosecuted.
Oh, well, that's interesting. Well, there have been some farm labor cases that have, none of them been prosecuted at a state level, but have been some civil type of cases. Now, the camps themselves, I can't think of, but there have been some of the H-2A worker cases where we've seen those go to court. And what I've learned about this whole process with farm camps is that it really is quite detailed, and that a lot of the exploitation happening is on the farm labor contractor side. So most growers or farmers, because they're not bicultural and bilingual, they hire someone to oversee the guest workers that are coming in, and they pay that person everything that they're supposed to. And then it's that person, the farm labor contractor, that is not in turn treating the workers the way they legally are supposed to, or giving them the money they're supposed to, or sometimes they're charging crazy fees for taking them to get laundry or different places. And so what we are working on in North Carolina is kind of trying to research some other states, because there are states that have implemented a system where they certify farm labor contractors on a state level, and that allows them some more control over what's happening. And so we are exploring this. We haven't introduced anything yet to the full commission, but are hoping to come up with some good ideas and some good ways to try to deter some of that that's happening within the guest worker population. Does that seem to answer?
I think it did, yeah.
Okay.
I don't have any other questions that are coming up at this time.
Okay, thank you, thank you. So this fact, I mean, I know that we have all learned a lot about trauma and how trauma impacts the brain, the effect on the brain, especially at young ages with complex or continued trauma. And the thing that I want to talk about here is, we know that toxic stress kind of changes the way that our brain functions. And we know that when our brain experiences trauma, and what we're set up to do when there is some kind of crisis is our brains are set to shut off the thinking part of our brain and turn on that alarm part, right? So whether that's so we respond correctly to a fire or maybe a car accident in front of us, right? The point is so that our brain will shut the thinking part off and just react like it needs to. And so trauma plays a role in the mindset of a victim because they are so often stuck in that alarm mode and crisis mode, because they are kept in such states of abuse and violence and trauma that the thinking part of their brain is truly off. And in a sense, they're carrying out actions involuntarily, kind of this programmed response that they have become accustomed or used to. And so this is important not only in, when you're trying to do an interview or trying to help get someone out of the abuse that they're experiencing, any ways that we can find to help de-escalate that crisis feeling in them will help us along that road. So I've talked with law enforcement and others who have said that, they've realized that when they are interviewing a victim or potential victim, that it really takes about their third interview before they try to get much detail on anything trafficking related, because they are trying to get that comfortability level going and that trust and rapport built. And some of that does have to do with just that trauma side of things. So we often see too where, offering someone food and those kind of things, food and water, and, that can help de-escalate things. But I think I have another slide that revisits some of this in a minute. And then this wheel of power and control is put out by Polaris and the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And this is very similar to the domestic violence and wheel of control and power. And so it shows you here kind of how this manipulation and all of the different pieces that go into keeping someone entrapped in this life. And so what I like to point out here is really that it doesn't happen immediately, that we do have to also put a lot of effort in undoing this, and undoing this wheel that has been so programmed in. So when we look at, I see that we have about 15 minutes left. So I do want to get to the recognizing and responding side of things. Red flags, I hope that I've given some red flags all along this presentation. But these are some of the red flags that you see often if you Google this to look for it on the internet. But there are lots of different situations. Someone may not be free to leave or come and go. They may have a lot of money, but not able to spend that money that's on them. So I've seen a situation where police brought someone to a shelter that I used to work at, and they did not confiscate her money. They knew that she was a victim, even though she had not admitted anything to them. And so in walking in, she was very much, hesitant about why she wasn't arrested, why these different things. And throughout the talk, as I was doing her intake paperwork, she started off, of course, saying that this guy was a partner and that he sold drugs while she was engaged in prostitution, and they were just partners. And then a little bit down the line, it was, well, he's my bodyguard. And then a little bit down the line, she said, well, he's kind of my manager. And so when we got into that, and I said at some point, I said, well, I know this particular officer didn't confiscate your money from you. And so tell me why you chose to come to a shelter instead of a hotel. And she said, oh, I can't spend this money. And so that was kind of a red flag to me that, this manager, she may not be as in control of her own money as she says that she is. And so slowly through that conversation, by the time we got to the end of it, she very much was admitting that this was a situation where he was her pimp and that she was under his kind of control. So anyway, so some other red flags that you see here, so people can actually be paid. They may be paid very little or not paid what they were promised, but you can be paid and still be a victim of trafficking. Things that can be red flags is working unusual hours, long excessive hours. If you see a massage business that's open 24/7, that's a red flag. Maybe they're not allowed breaks, or they have unusual restrictions. Maybe they talk about having to pay off a debt or being tricked into the work that they're doing. Sometimes there's security measures or certain living conditions. Sometimes there's not. Let's see, not in control of their own identification or documents. This can be a big red flag if they don't have their own documents. If they're not allowed to speak for themselves, if they live on site. So if you, one of the things we tell health inspectors is if you're inspecting a restaurant or a nail salon or other places and there's mattresses in the back or evidence that people are living there, then that's a sign as well. Past history of abuse obviously puts people higher at risk. We've always heard that when we're talking about our teenagers that an older, much older boyfriend or partner is a huge red flag as well. Of course, I mentioned the tattoos or branding type things, sudden changes in behavior, new possessions. So someone may not be able to spend their money, but maybe they have, new name brand clothes that you can't explain where they came from or different things like that. So this is probably a good time for me to point out. So one of the handouts that I sent ahead is a very long one. I still use it because I think it gives so much direction, but it is about an 8-page handout from Polaris International, and it does list red flags, but it also lists questions that you can ask in different situations. So if you think that you have met someone or you think you might be seeing someone, it gives you quite a bit of guidance. It also talks about interviewing in a trauma-informed way, and so it is a great resource for you to use. The other great resources out there, the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Of course, their website is wonderful, but they have a hotline and a text line as well. And so this line is really there just for anybody to call and ask questions. You can report an incident. You can give this number to a potential victim that might need to call and get help immediately. This number, when there is a victim or a tip, they route that back to certain professionals within North Carolina that are on this hotline protocol that we have. And so it really does, if you report even the smallest tip, it really does get looked into and checked out by someone local to North Carolina or even sometimes local to certain cities. Learning more, of course, about questions to ask or tools to use. I mentioned SOAR earlier. These are things you can just Google and it will pop straight up. SOAR, HEAL, the Office of Victims Crime has a training and technical assistance center that has online videos that you can watch, lots of different materials. The Vera Institute has some screening tools. Shared Hope International has lots of information on child sex trafficking and exploitation. So any of these are great resources to learn more. And what I often say, for whatever population that you serve, having something ready, you'll find, you'll find sheets on some of these websites that are one-page fact sheets that you can give to a parent or someone if you think that they suspect this happening to their youth. And then, of course, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children is a great resource as well. Some things that practitioners can do. Let me try to make sure I get into this as well. Treatment for, so when we're looking at treatment for substance addiction, substance misuse, and human trafficking, just to give you kind of a summary of some of the studies out there, there's not a ton out there that's really comprehensive and solid, but what is out there, of course, kind of draws the connection between higher experiences of trauma and needing more ongoing support. And that is true from my past experience working with victim survivors of human trafficking, is that it really did vary on the level of supports they needed. But quite often, sex trafficking victims needed a lot more support than families in our homeless shelter that we worked with every day. A 2018 study also looked at sex trafficking of runaway and homeless youth ages 12 to 25. And what it found was that almost half of the youth reported being victims of human trafficking scored at least 7 on the adverse childhood experiences scale, which is super, super high. And that was compared to about 25% of the non-trafficked youth. So the core general approach has been, of course, to meet basic human needs and build trust and rapport, use interpreters when we need to, be conscious of language that might blame or seem judgmental, remaining sensitive to those power dynamics, and not re-traumatizing someone. So let's see. What's working? So multidisciplinary approaches. This is probably not super. This seems to be what's working with almost every population, but an approach that's survivor, victim-centered, and culturally relevant, evidence-based. When there is evidence-based, gender-sensitive, trauma-informed. We really cannot address recovery or for substances or successfully move someone out of the life without addressing the trauma. The important thing too for professionals that are out there, that depending on, maybe you're somebody that just does screening and assessment type things, is to ask questions that determine those next steps with a client, but try not to go too far. So if you've determined enough to know that there's trafficking and to make a call to the hotline or to find some services to take over next, then that's good to stop at that point and get those services linked in, because it can be very, very re-traumatizing for someone to tell their full story to you and then have to turn around and tell it again to one of the shelters that's going to intake them for human trafficking or different things. So trying to just keep in mind to get the information that you need, and then connecting them to the right services. Of course, it makes sense to interview alone if they're with somebody, to try to separate, even if they're with another female. We often see traffickers use someone that will pose as an aunt or a family member that goes into maybe an emergency room with them, because they know that they're less likely to be seen as a potential abuser, but in fact they are somebody that will report back to that trafficker everything that the victim said or did. So yeah, and it's also important to remember that as someone is kind of coming out of the life and they are de-escalating from all the trauma, they often remember things that they did to themselves or that they did to others during that time period. And so helping make sure that they're connected to get that help. What else is working is identifying triggers and how they play a role in recovery. So in housing type programs, loss of power and different things can be a trigger that keeps their mind going into that alarm mode and out of that thinking mode that they need to be in. Building trust, changing the narrative about who they are, helping people see that they're worthy and that good things do happen. Experiential groups that involve just fun and joy and healthy connections seem to be showing some positive results with this intersection of human trafficking and substance use. Of course, we always need safety and risk assessments. We do learn that sometimes after someone has shared a whole story or had a memory recovered that they forgot about, that it does elevate their risk for potential suicide or relapse even. Peer-to-peer mentoring, harm reduction models. It's also kind of important to point out that, often people that have been trafficked, if they have ever been in jail, or even if they were kind of in a locked type of facility when they were being trafficked, that can be a real trigger as well. So when we're looking at trying to detox them, the very facility that needs to detox them could be a trigger for them as well. Of course, when we look at trauma-informed and victim survivor-centered, we always want to remember that recovery is possible and that healing happens in relationships. So all of the things on these slides are good kind of thoughts to have. We want to remember that everybody's developed their own defense mechanisms and coping mechanisms. And so for ourselves as well as professionals, that we have to take care of ourselves and kind of monitor what toxic stress we're taking in and this vicarious trauma that we learn, because we can start to see this work as blaming others. We can begin to say that someone's trying to get away with things or misusing the system, when in truth, this is defense mechanisms and coping mechanisms that have helped them to survive this whole time. What's not working? Okay, so we know like blame and shame is not working. Prosecuting victims as criminals, not working. There were a couple of studies that talked about having drop-in centers, and that drop-in centers themselves did seem to be successful, but allowing people to come in high often disrupted some of the other success that people were having. Some areas can be triggering as well. If it's a program that forces any kind of religious activities, that can sometimes be something that's triggering to people, and should really be, talked about as much as possible and as openly as possible about what kind of things might be triggers, what kind of programs and housing facilities might be triggers before someone is referred to a program. A common barrier is that, once again, we go back to some of our shelters and other programs. Sometimes to get into a program, there's a 6-month clean time required, and you can imagine how difficult that is for someone that's been forced drugs and forced into the commercial sex market or other types of labor situations. And so if we can get away from having to have someone enter shelters with a negative drug test or having a certain clean time, then that actually would be beneficial to many of our victim survivors of trafficking. Okay, so I see that we are right at 3 o'clock. And so I'm going to go to my slide I had some commission slides just in case in here. But this is my contact information and email address. We do have an active contact list that we send out normal announcements and training information to. And so you can request to be put on that by emailing me, or you can go to our website as well to look for information. But I just can't thank you enough for everybody that has called in today and participating in this.
Christine, I don't have any other questions. And then a link from today's materials will be posted and provided to everyone by email. There's also going to be certificates that are emailed out. So if everyone can complete those, that will be helpful, but that's all we have. So thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I hope everybody has a good day. Go do something fun.
All right. Thanks.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.